My wife cheated on me with a smug coworker, so I made sure they both lost everything. My wife Claire, fake name, and I have been married for 6 years. No kids yet, but we always talked about it. It was always on the horizon, you know. Just around the corner, we'd say. But we kept pushing it back. First, it was the house. We wanted to get settled in our new place. Then it was our jobs, wanting to feel secure in our careers. Then it was the money, saving up a bit more of a cushion. Looking back, I realized the perfect time was never going to come. Maybe I was the only one who really wanted kids, and she was just going along with it. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid now, but honestly, she's given me zero reason to trust anything she says anymore. Like I can't believe anything coming out of her mouth. Claire works in sales, and a huge part of her job is socializing and networking. She's always going to these lunches, cocktail parties, industry events, you name it. She says it's crucial for building social capital, which I'll be honest, I still don't fully understand. Apparently, it's a big deal in her department. Most of these things were employees only, but sometimes partners were invited, and I'd tag along. Honestly, it felt like one big excuse to get hammered on the company dime, but what do I know? Let me tell you, I hated those things. It was just a bunch of people in suits pretending to like each other for a few hours, then sneaking off to talk business in hushed tones. I'm a roofer, so I'm used to honest, hard work, not all this schmoozing. But I went along with it to be supportive of Claire. That's how I met Gary. First impression, total tool. He was one of those guys who's always sucking up, trying to act like your best friend, but in this condescending way. You know the type, calls you my guy when you've barely spoken 2 sentences to him. Yeah, that was Gary. He had this way of talking that just set my teeth on edge. He would always make these backhanded compliments that were supposed to be funny, but were really just insults. I got weird vibes from him from the get-go. I remember the first time we met, I told him I was a roofer, and he goes, "Well, that's certainly a career choice," in this tone that made it clear he thought it was a bad career choice. Like, what's that supposed to mean? It's honest work and puts food on the table. Anyway, I usually just ignored his snide remarks for Claire's sake. I didn't want to create any bad blood between her and her coworkers. I mean, that's a fair thing for a husband to consider, right? But then, about a month ago, at another one of these corporate shindigs, he said something that I just couldn't let slide. I had to leave early because I had a job the next morning, and I needed to get some sleep. I was going to head out without Claire. But then Gary chimed in with, "Don't worry, I'll keep taking great care of her for you." He was all smirk. It was the way he said it. It was dripping with this smugness, like he had some inside joke with my wife that I wasn't in on. And the worst part? Claire's reaction. She called him an idiot, but it was in this playful, flirty way. She was all blushing and giggling, like she was enjoying the attention. Immediately, the whole work wife/work husband thing popped into my head, and I was not okay with that. Not at all. In that moment, all the pretense of being the polite, supportive husband went out the window. I told him point blank that Claire was coming home with me. It wasn't what we'd agreed on, and she started to argue, but I think she saw the look in my eyes because she just shut it down, said her goodbyes, and left with me. The whole vibe was so off. The car ride home was brutal. We didn't speak for the longest time, and when we finally did, it exploded into this massive argument. She accused me of overreacting to a harmless comment. I told her that I didn't give a damn about Gary's comment because I knew he was a tool, but that her reaction, batting her eyelashes at another man right in front of me, was completely disrespectful. It made me wonder what the hell she got up to when I wasn't around. It felt like she was flaunting it in my face. She completely ignored that part and just kept harping on about how I was rude to her coworker. We went around and around in circles, getting nowhere. Things were tense as hell after that. I made a point of not going to any more of her events. And she, in turn, became a lot more tight-lipped about what went on at work. She stopped mentioning Gary altogether. I honestly didn't want to hear anything about that guy. But another part of me felt uneasy. It didn't feel like she was trying to spare my feelings. It felt like she was hiding something, like there was this big secret she was keeping from me. The whole situation just felt so wrong. After a while, things seemed to go back to normal, at least on the surface, but that incident with Gary was just eating away at me. I didn't have any proof of anything, nothing concrete. Honestly, I mostly just suspected she had a crush on him, or maybe it was a bit of mutual flirting. But that didn't stop me from losing trust in her. Every time she said she had to work late, I'd picture her and Gary together, laughing, flirting, maybe more. It was driving me crazy, this uncertainty, this constant nagging doubt. So yeah, I started keeping tabs on her. She hated it, but I started calling her more often when she was out at these work things. Most of the time, things seemed to check out. She'd answer the phone sounding annoyed, and I'd hear the typical office party chatter in the background. But then, one day, I heard something that just confirmed all my worst fears. She was out for drinks with some clients they were trying to butter up, the usual deal. I called her, and I heard the usual background noise, but then I heard him. Gary's voice, loud and clear. He's calling again. It's unbelievable how clueless he is. She hung up immediately, but it was too late. I'd heard it. It felt like I'd just walked in on them in bed together. I was furious. Beyond furious. The disrespect was so much deeper than I'd even imagined. Not only was she sleeping with this guy, but she'd had the nerve to flirt with him right in front of me. And they'd been making fun of me behind my back, calling me clueless. My first instinct was to drive right down there and punch that smug look off his face. I'm a pretty big guy and he's, well, let's just say he's not exactly built for a fight. I knew I could take him. He wouldn't be laughing about me being a roofer then, that's for sure. But I forced myself to cool down. I was so angry that I wasn't even sure Claire would be safe after I'd dealt with Gary, and I didn't want to do anything stupid, anything I'd regret. So I waited at home, just stewing in my anger, replaying that phone call over and over in my head. I felt like I was going to explode. And then it hit me they thought I was clueless, right? Then I'd play clueless. So this was my plan. When she got home, I'd pretend I hadn't heard a thing. Then, when she was asleep, I'd go through her phone and get all the evidence I needed. This was definitely heading to divorce, and I needed proof to make sure things went my way. But it wasn't just about the divorce. I wanted to make Gary pay. I needed to get my hands on solid proof and make him regret what he'd done to me. I wanted him to feel the same pain I was feeling. Claire came home that night acting guilty as hell. She got back much earlier than usual, like she'd rushed home to do damage control. She called out my name in this cautious way, like she was afraid I'd be mad at her. And I was, of course, but I pretended not to be. I just asked her how the party was, how the business went, all casual-like. She answered in this unsure voice, and within 5 minutes, she seemed convinced that I hadn't heard Gary. Oh, she'd find out soon enough. For the rest of the night, I played the part of the trusting husband. We had dinner, watched some TV, but every time she glanced at her phone, I felt that anger bubbling up inside me again. I remember thinking it would actually work out in my favor if she texted him something incriminating that night. I wanted her to, in a way, so I'd have even more ammunition. It sucks to be right sometimes. When she finally went to bed, I waited until I could hear that soft, even breathing that meant she was asleep. Even then, I gave it another 15 minutes, just to be sure she was really out. Then, I went for her phone. My hands were shaking. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not an easy guy to scare, but my heart was pounding out of my chest as I navigated to her messages. The future of my entire relationship, my whole life, really, hinged on what I was about to find in there. And what I found. It floored me, right from the very first message. I was completely shocked, but not surprised, if that makes sense. I was right that she'd been texting him that night. She was telling him how relieved she was that I hadn't overheard him. And then they were making fun of me, mocking me for being so stupid, so oblivious to their little secret. But there was so much more. They'd been having an affair for 6 months. 6 months. Hotel rooms, dates. It seemed like most of it had been happening on nights when she had work events where I wasn't required. I made sure to text everything to myself. It wasn't easy going through all those messages. Not just because there were so many of them, but because the content was just disgusting. The pet names, the inside jokes, the explicit details. It made me sick to my stomach. The anger was creeping back in, stronger than ever. I was done pretending. I couldn't take it anymore. This was so much worse than I ever could have imagined. I shook her awake roughly. I didn't hurt her, but she was startled, afraid. She started to say something, but I cut her off and asked her if she had anything to say for herself. She was groggy and confused at first, but she sobered up real quick when she saw that I had her messages open on her phone. Her face went white as a sheet, and you know what the first thing she did was? She went on the defensive. Apparently, I was the bad guy for going through her phone behind her back. She claimed I didn't have the right to do that I couldn't possibly understand things without the proper context. I was actually shocked at how much she seemed to believe her own BS. It was like she was living in some alternate reality. I couldn't stand to hear another word of it, so I ignored her. and told her that I'd heard Gary's remark. I quoted how they'd made fun of me for being clueless and pointed out that I'd had my suspicions about them for a long time. I told her I had more than enough reason to go through her phone. She didn't have an immediate response to that. She just stared at me, speechless, with this look of horror on her face. After a minute of silence, she started to get all misty-eyed and begged me to hear her out. And that's when she started playing the victim. She claimed that Gary had threatened to get her fired if she didn't go out with him, and that things had just escalated from there. According to her, it had all been to save her job. She was trying to paint herself as this helpless victim, forced into this situation. I didn't believe her for a second, not 1 second. The messages made it pretty clear that the whole thing had started with flirting, and most of it had come from her at first. I told her that I wasn't standing for betrayal, that we were over, and that I'd be filing for divorce first thing in the morning. This was non-negotiable. There was no coming back from this, and that's when the waterworks really started. She begged me not to throw away our marriage over a mistake. She insisted that she loved me, that we could still fix things. I laughed in her face. 6 months of sneaking around behind my back, betraying me, mocking me with another man. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. And now she wanted to patch things up because she got caught. What a joke. An absolute joke. I told her to save the theatrics for someone who cared. I wasn't interested. She spent the rest of the night begging me to reconsider, alternating between pleading and accusing. When she got tired of me stonewalling her, she eventually cried herself to sleep. I was out of the house before she even woke up the next morning. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her anymore. I had a lot of work to do, but I made sure to find some time to talk to a divorce lawyer and get the ball rolling. I'm still messed up over all of this, obviously. It's like my whole life has been turned upside down. But getting started with the divorce, that made me feel like I had some control back, like I was taking back my life. I can't wait to be free of Claire, but I'm also looking forward to making Gary pay for what he did. I wanted him to suffer. Update. Okay, so I'm back. And I'm happy to report that I got back at both of them, in the end. The hardest part was honestly the waiting. I wanted to strike back at Gary immediately, but my lawyer, thankfully, talked some sense into me. He told me I'd be putting my case at risk if I did anything rash. He said he was aiming to get me little to no alimony, and the best way to do that was if Claire still had a job. And there was a good chance she'd lose her job if her and Gary's affair became public knowledge at their workplace. It made sense, legally speaking, but it killed me to have to wait. It was tough, but I agreed to hold back. I won't bore you with all the nitty-gritty divorce details. Let's just say it was a divorce. Not fun. A lot of hard feelings all around. But the real miracle was that Claire didn't get any alimony from me. She had a good job, after all. At least she did for now. Once the dust from the divorce had settled, I got to work on the next part of the plan. It was Gary's turn. I'd had all the screenshots ready for weeks, just waiting for this moment. You see, Gary was a married man, with 2 kids. I'd always known he was married. I'd even met his wife, Amy, a few times at those awful work events. But finding out he had kids, that really disgusted me. He never stopped to think about them, about the damage this affair would do to his own family. I couldn't believe how selfish he was. He'd ruined 2 families with his actions, all for what? A few cheap thrills. He hadn't thought for a second about what this would do to his kids. I felt bad for the kids, and for Amy, but I still had to go through with my plan. It was better for them to find out who their father really was, sooner rather than later. And there was no way in hell I was letting Gary get away with this scot-free. He had to face the consequences of his actions. It was easy enough to find Amy's Facebook profile. The rest was even easier, although I'd been living this moment in my head, almost daily for the past few months, and let me tell you, it was just as sweet as I'd imagined. I started off by introducing myself, reminding her that we'd met a few times at work functions. I didn't bother waiting for her to reply. I explained that our spouses had both lied to us, and carried on an affair together for over half a year. I told her that it was only fair for her to know the truth so she could make her own decision about what to do. I let her know that my marriage had ended because of this, that I was already divorced. I wanted her to know the full extent of the damage. In less than an hour, she replied, asking if this was all true. She said she'd heard about my divorce, but she'd never heard anything about her husband being involved. I'd expected her to attack me, or to insist that I was lying, trying to destroy her marriage or something. Instead, she was just asking me, almost pleadingly, to confirm that I was telling the truth. It was heartbreaking, honestly. So I did. I sent over all the screenshots I'd taken of their conversations. Everything. The flirting, the planning, the I love yous, the hotel arrangements, the crude jokes about me, all of it. I even sent over censored versions of the pictures they'd sent each other. I figured she deserved to know the full extent of their depravity. She didn't reply for quite a while, and I didn't blame her. There was a lot to go through there, and not just in terms of quantity. It was heavy stuff to read, even for me, and I'd already been through it once. I remembered how bad I'd felt when I first saw those messages. I couldn't even imagine what she was going through. I felt bad for her, truly, but I didn't regret what I'd done, not for a second. We both deserved to be with people who respected us, who returned the love we offered. We both deserved better than to be lied to and cheated on. I didn't hear back from her until the next morning. She told me she had confronted Gary with the messages, and they'd had a huge fight. The fight of the century, apparently. She'd kicked him out of the house and was seriously considering divorce. She was devastated, heartbroken, and furious, all at the same time. I felt a bit of sick satisfaction when I recommended my divorce lawyer to her. He'd helped me get a fair deal out of my divorce, and it felt like a nice little way to stick it to Gary, one last twist of the knife. We didn't keep in touch much after that, but I heard the rest of the story from, of all people, my ex-wife. You can't make this stuff up. She called me the same day, absolutely furious. She called me petty and insecure for ruining Gary's relationship. I was a bit surprised, at first, that she would call me to defend the man she'd cheated on me with, but honestly, at that point, nothing she did could surprise me anymore. I just told her that I couldn't sympathize with cheaters, unlike her. Her angry sputtering made the whole thing worth it, I'm not gonna lie. It was music to my ears. It only got better when she accused me of ruining his life. It turned out that Gary wasn't just losing his marriage, he was losing his job too. Claire was close to tears as she told me that Amy had reported him to their company's HR department. Apparently, the company had a strict no fraternization policy, and they'd launched an investigation immediately. There was a good chance that both he and Claire were going to be fired any day now. Karma's a bitch, isn't it? She started going on about how she couldn't handle the stigma, how people were whispering about her at work, how some of her co-workers were being cold to her, and how she was certain some of the clients had heard about the affair. She was seriously considering just giving up and resigning. She asked me, pretty sarcastically, if I was happy now. Like she was the victim in all of this. I told her completely seriously that I was. It wasn't my problem anymore. I was kind of pissed to hear her whining and making herself out to be the victim when I was the one who had been mocked, lied to, and betrayed. Suddenly, I wasn't enjoying hearing about how she'd ruined her life. I just wanted nothing to do with her anymore. I said, at least you can still have each other, and ended the call. It was the last time we spoke. And it turns out, they didn't still have each other. I heard from Amy later on that Gary had skipped town after the divorce. He'd lost his marriage, his job, his kids, and his reputation. He was persona non grata. I wish I could have seen the look on his smug face when it all came crashing down around him. I bet he wasn't calling anyone clueless anymore. But that's enough about them. They're not worth any more of my time or energy. I'm moving on with my life. I still have my pride, my business, and my dignity, and I'm going to keep building up my life without her. In the end, Gary and Claire were the ones who lost everything. They both thought they could play games, fool around with other people's lives, and just walk away unscathed. They thought they were so clever, so untouchable. Well, they learned their lesson the hard way. So yeah, that's my story. It's messy, it's painful, but it's real. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that honesty and integrity still matter. And that karma, well, she's always watching. Always. Thanks for listening to me vent, internet strangers. It means more than you know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a life to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I'm actually looking forward to it.